Silence of the Unseen, the house on Sallow Hill. Emily and Daniel arrived at Sallow Hill Manor, an eerie, decaying estate nestled in a valley surrounded by fog-thick woods. The gravel crunched under the tires of their car as Emily slowed to a stop, the imposing mansion looming ahead of them. The house wasn't just old, it was suffocating. Vines crawled up its crumbling stone walls like they were trying to choke the life out of it. Windows, black and empty, reflected nothing but the swirling mist that hugged the ground. The wind carried the faint smell of damp soil, rotting wood, and something faintly metallic like rusted iron. Emily's stomach churned as she opened the car door. She pulled her coat tighter, shivering, though it wasn't from the cold. The house felt alive, like it was waiting for them. "It's bigger than I thought," Daniel muttered, his gaze flicking from the house to the surrounding forest. His breath came out in puffs of white as he exhaled. Emily didn't respond. She knew exactly what he meant. The house seemed to stretch higher the longer she stared at it, its shadow swallowing them whole. Her uncle's death had been sudden and strange, leaving her the sole inheritor of the property. She had thought this trip would be a chance to renovate the house, maybe sell it, and move on. But standing there now, she felt a tightness in her chest. She grabbed her bag and followed Daniel inside. The door groaned as it swung open, the sound echoing through the empty halls. Dust coated the wooden floor, and cobwebs hung like curtains from the ceiling. The air was damp, and the walls seemed to sweat moisture, giving off a faint smell of mildew. The grand staircase loomed ahead, its banister warped and splintered. The faded wallpaper, once a rich burgundy, peeled in jagged strips. The house wasn't just neglected, it was forgotten, abandoned by time itself. Daniel dropped his bags with a thud. "Well, it's got charm, right?" he said, forcing a laugh. Emily gave a weak smile. "Yeah, if you like haunted mansions." They spent the afternoon unpacking in silence, the heavy atmosphere pressing down on them like a weight they couldn't shake. Emily tried to brush off the unease, blaming it on exhaustion. But that night, as they lay in bed, the house made its presence known. She woke to the sound of knocking. Tap, tap, tap. It was soft, rhythmic, and coming from inside the walls. Emily held her breath, listening as the knocks grew louder, more deliberate. She turned to wake Daniel, but he was fast asleep. Her heart thumped against her ribcage. Just as she convinced herself it was the house settling, she heard it, a whisper. "You're not supposed to be here." Her breath hitched. She sat up, eyes scanning the room. The whisper had been so close, as if someone had leaned down and breathed the words into her ear. The shadows in the corners of the room seemed to stretch and twist. She fumbled for the lamp, her fingers trembling, and when she finally switched it on, the room was empty. But the sensation lingered, like something had been there and left only a trace behind. The next morning, she found muddy footprints near the bed, small footprints, child-sized. Her stomach twisted. She tried to show them to Daniel, but he waved it off. "We tracked them in yesterday," he said, yawning. "This place is old and drafty. You're just spooking yourself." But Emily couldn't shake the feeling. As they explored the house, they found a locked door at the end of a narrow hallway on the second floor. Emily tried the handle, but it wouldn't budge. She pressed her ear against the wood and thought she heard faint breathing, slow, labored, like something was just beyond the door. She pulled back, her skin crawling. "Maybe it's just a storage room," Daniel suggested, but Emily wasn't convinced. That night, she heard the door creak. She sat up in bed, straining to listen. It sounded like someone was opening it, slowly, cautiously. The hinges groaned, and then silence. She waited for the sound of footsteps, but none came. When Daniel went to check, the hallway was empty. The following day, they discovered something even more unsettling. A trapdoor hidden beneath a moth-eaten rug in the parlor. It was sealed with rusted chains, the wood around the hinges blackened as if it had been scorched by fire. Emily's curiosity warred with her fear. She leaned down, pressing her ear to the cold wood, and heard faint sobbing. Her breath hitched. "Daniel, do you hear that?" He shook his head, but his brow furrowed. "Emily, it's probably just the wind." Then they both heard it, a voice, muffled but unmistakable, whispering, "I see you." Daniel backed away, dragging Emily with him. He covered the trapdoor with the rug and forced a smile. "Let's not mess with that, okay?" But it was already messing with them. That night, Emily dreamed of wandering the dark hallways of the house. The paintings on the walls weren't paintings anymore. They were faces, eyeless and decaying, their mouths stretched into silent screams. One of them blinked and stepped out of its frame, dragging a rusted knife along the floor as it followed her. She tried to run, but the hallways seemed to stretch endlessly. She woke up gasping, her arm burning. When she pulled back her sleeve, she found 3 thin, fresh scratches. By now, Daniel couldn't deny something was wrong. When the basement door, which had been locked since they arrived, was suddenly wide open, he grabbed a flashlight and insisted on checking it out. The air down there was thick, almost suffocating, and the smell of rot made Emily gag. She waited at the top of the stairs, heart pounding, as Daniel's footsteps echoed below. Then the power went out. She heard him scream. Without thinking, she raced down the stairs, her flashlight flickering. She found him lying on the cold stone floor, unconscious. His shirt was ripped open, and deep claw marks raked across his chest. Something wet and slimy retreated into the shadows before she could see it. When Daniel came to, he didn't remember what had happened, but something had changed. His eyes were dull, his gaze vacant. At night, he would sit by the window, whispering to himself. Emily tried to snap him out of it, but he grabbed her wrist, his grip like iron. "She's inside me," he murmured. "I can't make her leave." Desperate, Emily searched the attic and found an old diary belonging to her uncle. His handwriting grew messier with each page, his paranoia bleeding through every word. "The unseen ones are here," he had written. "They live in the walls. They whisper your name to take you. Never let them whisper your name." Her hands shook as she read it. Then she heard it, her name, whispered softly behind her. She spun around, but the attic was empty. By now, Daniel was slipping further away. His skin was pale, and he barely ate. One night, she woke to find him standing at the foot of the bed, staring at her with glassy eyes. She screamed, and he blinked, as if waking from a dream. "I don't remember getting up," he said, voice hollow. Things reached a breaking point when Emily found him hanging from the ceiling in the dining room. His body swayed gently, but when she screamed and ran to him, his eyes snapped open. His lips moved and he whispered, "You'll be next." Panicking, Emily tried to leave the house, but the forest seemed to twist and turn, leading her back to the front door. No matter which path she took, she always ended up at the house. The entity revealed itself that night. A skeletal figure draped in shadow, its hollow eyes dripping black ichor. It told her she was always meant to come back, that she had lived here as a child and forgotten. Memories flooded her mind, memories of her uncle performing a ritual to protect her, binding the entity to the house. But that binding was breaking. Emily found the ritual room hidden beneath the basement. The walls were covered in ancient symbols and bones. She realized she had to destroy the diary to sever the entity's connection. As she set it on fire, the house shook violently. Shadowy figures clawed at her, their screams deafening. She barely made it out before the house collapsed in on itself. Gasping for air, she stumbled into the woods. Convinced it was over, but then she saw it, the locket lying in the dirt, her mother's locket. She opened it with trembling fingers and found a picture of Sallow Hill Manor, perfectly intact. Inside was a note that read, "You'll be back." Whispers in the dark. Emily Rivers drove through the winding, rain-soaked road as lightning forked across the sky, casting the towering trees in ghostly silhouettes. Her knuckles were white as she gripped the steering wheel, the weight of her decision pressing down on her like a boulder. It had been 6 months since she barely escaped Solo Hill Manor. 6 months of sleepless nights, endless therapy sessions, and whispers in her mind that wouldn't go away. She had burned the house to the ground, or so she thought. But 2 nights ago, a package arrived on her doorstep, containing her mother's locket and a faded photograph of the house standing as pristine as it had ever been. Attached was a note. "You didn't finish it." The nightmares returned that same night. Her uncle's screams, Daniel's lifeless body swaying from the ceiling, and the shadowy figure dripping black ichor. She had no choice. She had to go back. The whispers had followed her this far, and the only way to stop them was to face the source. The headlights illuminated the gravel driveway as she arrived at the house, or what should have been the house. She gasped. It stood there, whole and untouched by fire, as though it had never been destroyed. Ivy crept up the walls, but this time the windows weren't empty. They flickered with a soft, warm glow. Someone, or something, was inside. The rain pounded against the hood of her car as she sat there, frozen. She could leave. She could turn around and pretend the package never arrived. But when the wind carried a faint voice calling her name, she knew she had no choice. She had been summoned. Emily grabbed her flashlight and stepped out into the rain. The gravel crunched beneath her boots as she made her way toward the front door, which creaked open before she even touched it. Her pulse quickened as she entered the foyer. The smell hit her first: damp wood, mildew, and something else, like decaying meat. The wallpaper, once peeling and discolored, now looked freshly restored. The grand staircase seemed sturdier, its banister gleaming in the dim light. Something about the house felt alive in a way it hadn't before. She reached into her pocket and gripped the locket tightly. "I'm not afraid of you," she whispered to the shadows, though her shaking hands betrayed her. She pulled out her phone and snapped a picture of the foyer. The flash lit up the room for a split second and revealed a figure standing at the top of the stairs. Her breath hitched and the phone slipped from her hands, clattering to the floor. When she looked back up, the figure was gone. Her heartbeat pounded in her ears as she picked up the phone and checked the picture. Nothing. The stairs were empty. "This is exactly how it started last time," she whispered, tears threatening to spill. But she forced herself to move forward. She had to know why the house had returned, and why it still wanted her. The door to the parlor creaked open on its own. Emily hesitated before stepping inside. The air was thick, and the scent of burning wood stung her nostrils. The fireplace was lit, flames crackling softly. A figure sat in the armchair by the fire, their back to her. Her heart stopped. "Daniel?" The figure shifted but didn't turn around. His shoulders were hunched, his head tilted, as if he were listening to something only he could hear. Emily took a shaky step forward. "Daniel, it's me." He didn't respond. She moved closer, her breath fogging in front of her. Her fingers brushed against his shoulder. His skin was cold, like touching a marble statue. Slowly, he turned his head. His eyes were hollow, black pits, and his lips twisted into a grotesque smile. "You left me here," he said, his voice distorted, overlapping with a chorus of whispers. "You should have stayed." Emily screamed and stumbled backward, knocking over a side table. The fire in the hearth flickered and died, plunging the room into darkness. She scrambled to her feet, her flashlight flickering as she pointed it around the room. Daniel was gone. She bolted out of the parlor and up the staircase, her boots thudding against the wooden steps. Her breathing was ragged, her mind spinning. Was Daniel truly here? Or was the house playing its tricks again? At the top of the stairs, she hesitated. The hallway stretched endlessly before her, doors lining the walls like teeth in an open mouth. She remembered this hallway vividly from her nightmares. The locked door at the end, the whispers, the way it seemed to grow longer the more she ran. As she moved cautiously down the corridor, her footsteps echoed louder than they should have. The air seemed to hum around her, vibrating with anticipation. Her breath came in short gasps, and she fought the urge to turn around. When she reached the end of the hall, the locked door was slightly ajar, its hinges creaking as it swayed. She pushed it open and stepped inside. The room was cold, so cold that her breath came out in visible clouds. The walls were covered in drawings, just like before. Eyeless faces and cryptic symbols scratched into the wood. But this time, there was something new. In the center of the room was a large mirror, its frame blackened and scorched. Her reflection stared back at her, but something was wrong. The Emily in the mirror didn't move when she did. It stood perfectly still, its eyes hollow and lips curled into a malicious grin. "Why did you come back?" her reflection asked, its voice low and gravelly. Emily backed away, her fingers tightening around the locket. "I came to end this." The reflection laughed, a sound that reverberated through the room like nails scraping glass. The walls began to vibrate, and the symbols glowed faintly, pulsing like a heartbeat. "You can't end what you are." The room shook violently, and Emily fell to her knees as the floor beneath her cracked open. Shadowy hands reached out, grabbing at her ankles, pulling her downward. She screamed and clawed at the floor, her flashlight spinning away. The locket. Her mind screamed at her to open the locket. She fumbled with it, her fingers slipping as the shadows pulled her deeper into the cracks. With one final desperate tug, the locket popped open, revealing the photograph of the house. "No," she cried. "This isn't real. You're not real." The hands recoiled as a blinding light poured from the locket. The walls trembled, and the symbols on the floor burned away, leaving behind blackened scorch marks. Emily scrambled to her feet and stumbled out of the room as the house groaned like a living thing. The floor beneath her feet rippled, and she fought to keep her balance as she sprinted down the hallway. The front door was just ahead. She could see the rain through the glass, hear the wind howling outside. She reached for the doorknob, but the shadowy figure from her nightmares materialized before her, blocking the exit. Its hollow eyes dripped with black ichor, and its skeletal fingers stretched toward her. "You can't leave," it hissed. Emily screamed, swinging the locket toward it. The light from the locket blazed, and the entity recoiled with an ear-splitting shriek. She yanked the door open and stumbled outside into the pouring rain. The wind howled, and lightning illuminated the forest path ahead. She didn't stop running until the house was out of sight. When she finally collapsed by the side of the road, gasping for air, she opened the locket again. The photograph of the house had changed. It was no longer standing tall and restored. It was crumbling, covered in ash, with shadows creeping along its edges. A message was scrawled across the bottom of the picture. "You think it's over?" Emily sobbed, clutching the locket to her chest. Far off in the distance, Sallow Hill Manor flickered, its lights blinking like a heartbeat. It was waiting for her return. Return to Sallow Hill. Emily Rivers had barely slept since escaping Sallow Hill Manor. Again. For weeks she jumped at every creak in her apartment, flinched when her phone buzzed, and kept the lights on even in the daytime. But the locket never stopped haunting her. Every time she opened it, the image of the house became more distorted. Cracks spreading across the walls, dark shapes moving in the windows like something trapped inside and waiting for her. It was only a matter of time before the whispers returned. They started softly, just like before. At first, distant murmurs as she lay in bed. But within days, they grew louder, hissing her name from the corners of her room and seeping into her dreams. She couldn't escape them, and when her bathroom mirror fogged up that morning, revealing the message written in dripping letters, "You can't run," she knew there was no escaping what the house wanted. Her hands trembled as she packed a bag. She didn't tell anyone she was leaving. No one would understand why she needed to go back. Her therapist had warned her about feeding the obsession, calling it survivor's guilt or some form of trauma-induced psychosis. But Emily knew the truth. Solo Hill wasn't done with her, and until she ended this, it would never let her go. The road leading back to the manor felt longer this time. The weather was unnaturally calm, the sky a flat gray, as if the world itself were holding its breath. The gravel crunched under her tires as she pulled into the driveway, the house looming ahead like a predator lying in wait. Vines had grown thicker, wrapping themselves around the exterior like claws. But it wasn't the house's appearance that sent her heart racing. It was the fact that the front door was already open. Her pulse quickened as she stepped out of the car. She could turn around. She could leave the bag right here, get back in the car, and drive away. But she wouldn't be free. The whispers would follow her forever. Taking a deep breath, she walked toward the house. The floorboards creaked beneath her boots as she stepped inside. The air was heavy, suffocating, and filled with a familiar smell of damp wood and mildew. She turned on her flashlight, the beam cutting through the thick darkness as she made her way to the grand staircase. The moment her hand touched the banister, she heard it, a child's giggle, soft and playful, echoing from somewhere upstairs. Emily froze, her breath catching in her throat. The sound was innocent, but in this house, innocence was a lie. She climbed the stairs, each step groaning under her weight. The giggle came again, louder this time, leading her toward the locked door at the end of the hallway. It was wide open now, revealing the room beyond. The mirror was gone, replaced by something worse. In the center of the room was a child's crib, its wooden frame splintered and covered in cobwebs. Toys lay scattered across the floor. Old, broken dolls with missing eyes, stuffed animals whose seams had split open, leaking stuffing like entrails. Emily's stomach churned. She stepped closer, her breath fogging the cold air. Something was moving inside the crib. She leaned in, her flashlight trembling in her hands. The crib was empty, at least at first glance. But as she shone the light across the mattress, her heart nearly stopped. Tiny handprints, pressed into the fabric as if a child had just been lying there, slowly faded before her eyes. A whisper brushed against her ear. "You shouldn't have come back." She spun around, her flashlight cutting across the room. The shadows shifted unnaturally, clinging to the walls like living things. The doorway behind her slammed shut, the sound reverberating through the room like a gunshot. Emily backed into the corner, clutching the locket around her neck. "What do you want from me?" Her voice cracked, tears streaming down her face. The air grew colder, and the whispering intensified, layering over itself until it became a deafening chorus of voices. Then, from the shadows, a figure emerged. It was small, no taller than a child, but its eyes were hollow black pits and its skin was gray, stretched too tightly over its bones. It tilted its head, studying her. "Daniel," she breathed. It wasn't him, but the resemblance was close enough to make her knees weaken. The figure smiled, its mouth splitting unnaturally wide, revealing jagged teeth. "You left me here," it said in a voice that wasn't quite Daniel's but carried his pain. "Now you'll stay." Emily bolted for the door, slamming her shoulder against it until it burst open. She sprinted down the hallway, her breath ragged, the sound of footsteps pounding behind her. The walls seemed to pulse with each beat of her heart, the house itself alive and shifting around her. She stumbled down the stairs, nearly falling as she reached the foyer. The front door was in sight, but before she could reach it, the floor beneath her buckled, splitting open a gaping hole filled with darkness. She screamed, grabbing onto the banister as her feet slipped. From the hole, shadowy hands reached out, grasping at her ankles. Their touch was ice cold, sending pain shooting up her legs. "Let me go," she sobbed, kicking at the hands. Her foot connected with something solid, and the hands recoiled just long enough for her to pull herself up. She crawled across the floor, dragging her bag behind her. The locket. It had worked before. She yanked it from around her neck and opened it, holding it up like a shield. Light spilled out, and the shadows hissed, retreating into the cracks of the floor. The house groaned, and for a moment, she thought it would collapse on top of her. But then, everything went still. She staggered to her feet, clutching the locket. "I know what you are," she whispered, "and I know how to end you." Emily ran to the basement door and kicked it open. The air down there was even colder, thick with the smell of decay. She descended the stairs, her flashlight barely piercing the darkness. At the bottom, she found the ritual room, just as she remembered it. Bones, symbols, and the remains of burnt candles scattered across the floor. In the center of the room was a small wooden chest, its lid carved with runes that pulsed faintly. She didn't hesitate. She pried it open, revealing the remains of her uncle's journal, charred at the edges but still intact. She grabbed it, flipping through the pages until she found what she was looking for, the final ritual. Her fingers trembled as she read the instructions aloud, her voice echoing off the stone walls. The house groaned, and the shadows around her trembled, as if fighting back. But she didn't stop. She repeated the incantation, louder this time, forcing her voice to drown out the whispers. Suddenly, a figure emerged from the shadows, the skeletal entity with its hollow eyes and dripping black ichor. It lunged toward her, but Emily held the locket high. The light intensified, burning through the entity like fire. It screamed, its body writhing as it dissolved into ash. The ground beneath her shook violently, cracks spidering across the floor. The walls began to collapse, and Emily knew she had seconds to escape. She sprinted up the stairs, the house crumbling behind her. She barely made it through the front door before the entire structure collapsed in on itself, sending dust and debris flying into the night. Gasping for air, she turned back to see the ruins of Sallow Hill smoldering. The whispers finally silenced. The locket, still warm in her hand, snapped shut. But as she stood there, the wind carried one last whisper, faint but unmistakable. "You'll never be free." Emily's tears mixed with the rain as she whispered back, "I don't care." This time she walked away without looking back. Or so she thought.
Like and subscribe to get notified when part 2 drops in just a few days.